Hi, Mitu and Alta. Welcome to We Are All Translators. Thank you for joining me today. Let me quickly introduce you to our listeners and viewers. So Mitu Sanyal is a cultural scientist, journalist, critic, and author of two academic books, Vulva and Race, both of which have been translated into many languages. This, Identity, is the first novel, which has also been translated, in addition to English, into Dutch, Danish, and I believe Arabic. But English was, I believe, the first translation. Alta Price runs a publishing consultancy which specializes in literature and nonfiction texts on art, architecture, design, and culture. I have to say, I was very impressed when I went to Alta's website and saw the selected works because of the range, the diversity of books that you've translated. A recipient of the Goethe Kunst Prize, she translates from both Italian and German into English. And we've lost count of how many books Alta has done. This is the umpteenth book-length translation. So I'm very, very happy to welcome you both to discuss today Identity, the novel by Mitu, which has been translated by Alta. There you go. You've got the German and the English.
No, those are both English versions.
Oh, are they both? Oh, I thought one of them was the German. I see. Why? How is it that they've got different covers then?
The North American, the edition from Astra House basically has the same imagery, Raj Ravivarma, the lithography, the lithograph, as the German edition. Yeah, there we go.
Ah, yes.
Typographic treatment.
But although the German one has got this. It's
beautiful.
Yeah, we don't have that. And this is the UK, Ireland, and Europe edition coming out from B&Q Books this Saturday. Well, I don't know when we're going to air actually, but 1st of October.
But yes, it is October. Yes. Okay, so that's the UK and the US. Got it. Okay, wonderful. So with that, let me start first with you, Mitu, and I'd love to know how the novel came about. You've written nonfiction before. You're a scholar yourself. This is your first fiction. And I'm always curious about what is that moment of commitment when you decide, I'm going to take on this theme, this subject matter, but I'm going to use fiction as a way to tell this story. And of course, you've got this Rachel Dolezal kind of character, but what was that moment when you said, this is what I want to write and it's going to be fiction?
Well, in a way, most non-fiction writers I know are failed fiction writers. They're hard fiction, but it didn't work out. I definitely was. I love all my non-fiction, and I've just finished a non-fiction book again about Emily Brontë. So I will continue writing non-fiction as well. But I always wanted to write a novel, and I had written about a very similar subject matter before, and in Germany the book market just wasn't ready for it. They weren't interested. They said, this is lovely, but we've already got an Indian. We don't need another one in our program. They meant Arundhati Roy at the time. They didn't mean anybody.
Totally different books, of course, but there you go.
And her first book. They meant her first book, so to speak. And so quite a lot of publishers wanted to do another book with me because the two nonfiction books were quite successful in Germany. And then I offered them the novel, and they were, but nobody's going to read that. Sorry, we really like it, but nobody will want to read that. And my publisher, Hansa, they kind of dared to do the experiment and said, yeah, fine, we really love this and we want to do this. And the first edition was sold out after, I think, 2 days. And so it is a bestseller. So it's interesting that the idea, what do people want to read, how much it differs from what people think that people want to read, and who are readers as well.
Yeah.
So, and this book is very much kind of carried by community. So people, the book is about are also not just the people, but also a very big chunk of the readers. So my protagonist, my main character, Nivedita, is mixed race. So even her name, the way her name is pronounced is wrong because it's a German pronunciation. In India, it would be pronounced Nivedita. So she is kind of, even her name is a mixture between the one and the other. And she's trying to navigate her way, and she hasn't got any kind of role models until she goes to university and meets that professor, that very charismatic professor who is Indian. She's an activist, she's an academic, and she's a media star. And then very much at the end of the first chapter, she's debunked as being white. And so all her identity is based, so even Nivedita's identity, which is based on Saraswati, on the professor, is based on a lie. And I wanted to tell that story. So I want to write about identity, and I didn't think I could write that as a non-fiction book. I will tell you what identity is. I will tell you what racism is. Let's talk about that, and I will tell you the truth. And so I wanted to have different stories, different characters, different bodies in the book, and also the element of time, which we rarely have in non-fiction. So it is about the period of 9 months. So the first part is 3 weeks, and then we jump in time, and there's even a foreshadowing of the future. And so we do notice that everything that is true for them now is true, but it does change over time. It doesn't become irrelevant, but it does change.
It changes. And I think, to your point, I think what fiction, certainly with this book, allowed you to do is when you bring in all the voices. And so you're not, like you said, you're not telling the reader, this is what racism is and this is what identity politics is. You're allowing us to question our own ideas because we're seeing it through all these perspectives. And I want to come to that, those polyphonic voices in a bit. So now one other question I have for you before we move to Alta is, you've translated your own work before, you've self-translated, right, Neetu? And so with this novel, was there a particular reason you decided there is no way I'm going to translate this novel? Or, I mean, how did you decide that you were going to allow or have somebody else do the translation versus doing it yourself?
I mean, there are two answers to that. And there is the very simple answer: I didn't have the time. But even if I had the time, I wouldn't have done it because I can't do what Alta has done. I'm so impressed by this translation, and I'm so happy about it because the novel is so much closer to my heart in a way than my non-fiction. So when I get negative reviews to my non-fiction, I think, okay, they don't like the way I see the subject matter. When I don't like my novel, I think they don't like me, even though it's not about me as such, but it's in a way you are so much more naked. And I wouldn't have been able to do the same in English. Like I couldn't kind of play with the language. And so what Alta does amazingly, she plays with those different registers, and I just haven't got them. I could have written a BBC version of my novel.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because earlier this year I read Jhumpa Lahiri's essay collection, and she talks about how it's difficult for her to self-translate, especially with her fiction. And it's interesting because it would be a different book, is what she said. I could do it. She said she could write it. She could write it in because she is bilingual, as you are. And she said, but it would end up being a totally different book from the original that she wrote. And so that's interesting to hear you kind of saying how it is different to translate your own work.
Yeah, but
I've never done that. I am bilingual, but I've never self-translated. So it's interesting.
And when I did it with the non-fiction, I did notice I was happy with the translation, and I was a lot happier than because I got a trial chapter, and I noticed I didn't want to put my name to that. So they had changed the tone so much, and the tone, even though it was non-fiction, the tone was so important to what I had to say. So I wanted a slightly, not ironic, but slightly, I wanted this lightness, even though it was about a subject matter, it was about rape. So it was a non-fiction book about rape, a cultural history about rape, and I didn't want to reproduce the heaviness of the subject, and that was what the translation did, and I couldn't communicate that because it was immediately a political matter, and what Alta managed to do, and because even when you take just single sentences, they are different, but she keeps this. The book is floating in the translation, and that is amazing, and that's what I had hoped for, and I had read there was another translator, and I had read so I was allowed to choose. That was amazing, and it was very clear that Alta's translation wasn't just better, it was a different league. So basically there was no question to look at someone and know what to do with Alta, and nobody else.
Well, that's good to know. So also, let's switch to you. So how did you come to this novel? How did you find out about it? How did you decide you wanted to translate it?
So I had, of course, heard about it from friends in Germany who were reading it. I had dipped my toe into it, hadn't read the entire thing, when I got actually a fellow translator here in the United States. I'll name him because I like to name translators, Jeffrey Zuckerman, who translates from French into English, and does really remarkable work. He reached out and he actually didn't mention what book it was. He said, he knew this editor who was considering a book, and could he put us in touch? And I said, sure. And yeah, so I think at the time Astra House was considering buying it. They had not yet secured rights. So my feeling, without having done like an official reader's report, it was basically like, you should leap on this, jump on this opportunity, get the rights yesterday. If you don't, somebody else will. And by the way, yes, I would love to try translating this book.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned Jeffrey. I think he's very good at connecting people. I've noticed that.
He's an excellent connector.
Yes, very much. So before we get into the specifics of how Identity was translated, I do have some questions. But I wonder also, could you maybe share just some of the general challenges of translating from German into English? I mean, Identity has its own unique challenges you've mentioned in your postscript, and we'll come to that. But I think just in general for listeners and viewers who may not know, just some general things about translating from German to English that make it challenging in its own way.
This is so interesting because, it depends on the day, but I often wake up thinking I have nothing to say about translation today. And of course I have a lot to say about translation,
right.
But it's so difficult for me to generalize. I mean, this was absolutely unlike any other book I had done. And I did start my translation career with nonfiction. And it's interesting to me what Mitu said. It's absolutely right. The tone. So I think if you're outside of the translation world, it would be easy to say, literature is something else, but with nonfiction books or with journalism, tone doesn't matter so much. And that, in my experience, is absolutely false. Tone always matters. So in a sense, speaking from my own translation practice, genre doesn't really matter. And I actually have great difficulty, in pitching books or speaking to editors. They always want to know, like, what shelf would this go on in the bookstore? What labels are we going to put on this? And, I've learned how to do that. I never feel particularly successful, but in a sense, translation, to go back to what Jhumpa Lahiri said, I don't know that I can define what translation is, because I do feel that when a book is translated, it fundamentally becomes a different thing.
Yeah.
And sorry, I feel like I'm completely digressing from the question you asked, which is the specific challenges of German, Gesundheit. Is that, there are the obvious things that I feel like a lot of people know, which is the syntax, the sentence structure is very different, right? Yeah. So, but I think once you've been translating for a while, that's sort of built into your brain. I think I've seen, I feel also as though we all know when we read a translation and we recognize that it's in English, but something about it feels off. So, those syntax structures have to be different to my mind, unless the original is doing something unusual with German syntax. Then there's the issue, of course, of, the compound nouns. I saw really interesting, to give an example, I remember reading a translation and it mentioned, I think it was, and I should go back to my notes and look at what this is. It was many years ago, but it mentioned a time ghost. And I was like, what is a time ghost? And I realized it was zeitgeist. It was one of those, it's so literal and correct, that it's absolutely wrong. And that's also one of those terms that Zeitgeist, we use it in English, right?
I would have left
that
it.
word in the next novel now. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I would have left it as it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, fascinating things happen in translation.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned compound words, because I actually lived and worked in Berlin for about 6 months. And I had taken German at university. I studied engineering. I'd taken German at university, and I was working at Siemens in Berlin. And part of my job was to write my thesis in both German and English. And the compound words, especially in technical German, just killed me. The other problem was I was there in 93. This was very shortly after the wall had come down, as you remember. And so the West and East Berliners did not see eye to eye yet. And my boss was an East Berliner. He did not like, I remember this, he did not like anglicized words. And so whenever I would end up putting in, like you said, okay, Zeitgeist, and if somebody put in Time Ghost, I mean, I was very young. I was 21. And I had never been a translator. And to your point, I was putting in some cases, some anglicized words, and he would just mark the whole thing with red. He hated it. So, I mean, you've got cultural, I mean, I don't think it's as bad now, the whole East-West thing, but I mean, there was a time it was, right? And if you're writing a story that involves characters with those kind of diametrically opposing viewpoints, you have to take that into account in Germany, right? I would imagine. So, but yeah, I still have my thesis, and the compound words killed me. I would wake up sweating with nightmares, because some of those words just, the technical ones are difficult.
Yeah.
I don't suppose they're so bad in the novels, but
then there's slight, I mean, you don't get it as much with written and published work, but the regional differences.
Yes.
And those can be marked in German, but and this applies to other languages as well, but how do you convey when you know that someone is from Bavaria in a given text, and the other is, an Aussie or from the former East Berlin? And then also, do you translate certain street names, place names, all of those things? You can also leave it. It does something different in the text. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's very similar to what I deal with when I'm translating from Gujarati, because there are so many dialects. And in English, how do you show? Because a dialect is a signifier of class and caste and so many other social issues, right? And so, yeah, it's tricky. All right, well, we'll come specifically to identity. I want to switch back to Mithu, because I do want to talk about the novel's structure just a little bit, and how that then will come to alter, and how that worked with the translation. Because you've got articles, you've got blog posts, there's a quiz, there's tweets, there's Instagram, Facebook. There's even at the very end, as I was saying earlier, the beautiful reference list, Saraswati's lit list, and the sources and recommended further reading. So there's all this stuff, right? And you've even got real people. So you've got voices of real people responding to this fictional situation. Now, my first question is, this. I just think in fiction alone, that's difficult to do. And so what prompted you to maybe take this kind of approach with this novel?
That's a very good question, because especially the real people at the beginning, I really thought I want the internet in there. So the internet is such a multi-headed monster, and I can't write the internet. I mean, I can write loads of things, but I can write different characters, but I can't write the internet. And so I wanted to have kind of this polyphony in the novel, and I thought, brilliant idea. I ask people and they just write it for me. I don't have to do it. Problem solved, easy. And obviously, no, the opposite was the case. So everybody I asked said, okay, I've got to tweet about something that hasn't happened. How do I do that? No, not in the real internet, in the internet in the novel. How do I log into the internet in the novel? And it's because it wasn't there. Now it's there, it's obvious, but it wasn't there. And I was told nobody had done it before, which is possible because Twitter isn't that old. So I don't think it's that original an idea, but at that time, nobody knew what I meant. So every tweet, so there are 2-liners, usually it took me hours of explanation, long emails or long phone calls. and it was absolutely worth it. So because I've got all these different viewpoints, so they're all commenting on what's happening, but they're all doing it in different languages, in different registers, and they're recognizable, especially in Germany. So people have, the first reviews were, oh, Me Too is so good at mimicking, and then they name all these, especially Twitterati, so they're kind of well known in the social media world. And because they sound like themselves, because they've written it themselves, I haven't mimicked them. But also for me, it was a kind of corrective. So I wanted to know, would people really react that strongly? How would that play out? Is that just important to me? Is it just going on in my mind? And so it was loads of things at the same time. There was a very unsympathetic review that, oh, that is very clever of her, so nobody can criticize the book. So the rogue left can't say anything against it because they're in the book. I was like, that sounds like a brilliant idea. I wish I had had that idea. That would have been great. But I've always been fascinated with different texts, because we read a non-fiction text and we expect a certain kind of text, and without being told that, we reproduce that. So it's like we are all playing like in a play. So we've all got our assigned roles, and we write a text the way it's supposed to be written, and so we approach the text, and we are a different person vis-a-vis that text. So either we are learners and the text is telling us the truth, or the text is telling us the truth about our psyche, so that's why the test is in there. And so I wanted to kind of reflect that and kind of break this conceit. So they're all texts, so they're all conversations, but they're conversations that do different things to us because they assign us different roles then. And also
but it's so, yeah, I mean, I think it so reflects real life, because an issue such as this, you know, the story that you have, in real life, it would play out online exactly as you showed it. It would have been, I think, disingenuous if you had not included. I thought it was, I mean, a stroke of genius, yes, but I think it was absolutely necessary to have those viewpoints in there. But I mean, as I was reading and just thinking as a translator, I was like, oh my gosh, you know, there's all these different voices, and like you said, all these different registers. How on earth do you translate and make sure you're getting some of the slang? There's slang in there. And also you mentioned in your translator's note that, you know, not only do you have the German, but you've got the British English, the Indian English, the American English, French via English translation. You've got all these other languages as well in all these, you know, texts. And so, and all of it is just loaded language too, because they're talking about such a contentious subject matter. So how, I'm sure that wasn't easy to translate. You've mentioned some of it in your translator's note, but talk a little bit about, did you kind of have to create some rules of the road for yourself in terms of how you would approach translating all these different voices?
I suppose unofficially, yes, but it's not like I wrote them out and pasted them on the wall. Right. I mean, it's really, you know, I think had I been fully cognizant of what, this is probably true of every single book I do, had I been fully cognizant of what it would require, I might not have had the courage. But yeah, my naivete of just sort of, this looks fun, let me try. And then, you know, you get 200 pages into it and you're like, what am I doing? But I really do think, you know, I'm sure I've got the finished books here next to me. I do have a binder, you know, I printed it. I have tons of markup, and it was that going through, and it was, you know, you read it and then you read with a mind that, oh, I have to translate this now. And some of the characters, as of the very first reading, I'm hearing their voices in my head. So, okay, I'm seeing what this person's saying, and this is how they would say it in English. Others, I would have 3, 4, 5 options, and the best solution would not become clear to me until I had sort of let the rest of it wash over me. Am I answering your question?
Yes, yeah, no, I hear you. It's about getting those voices, hearing how they might sound in English. And even as you were saying that, I was relating that to kind of what I do with the Gujarati dialects, because it's already artificial and, translating an original Gujarati speaker in a novel or a story into English, because they wouldn't ever speak English. But then the reason I asked that rules of the road question, the current novel that I'm doing, which has over 200 characters, I've had to do that. I've actually had to put down certain words that I am going to translate a certain way for this character because he's lower class versus this character who happens to be an educated upper class person who would say it differently. And so I'm making my own kind of glossary, if you like.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought up that point, because there was a brief period of my career before I went full-time into translation that I was copy editing. And so I do, and I don't even, it's not a conscious thing anymore. I keep a style sheet for myself.
Okay, style sheet is the right word.
And I don't think of it really as rules, but sort of, okay, I know this person has said this before, but I do also want to say this. Me Too's writing is crystal clear to my mind, right? So even where I would have a doubt about how to treat something, it was really a matter of going back to the original and the answer was there. When she's got the third tweet that says Islam has no place in Germany and it's coming from a different person. I just know that's the internet troll. That's the denigrating. And so those things were very, very clear. So
there were signposts or markers for you.
Exactly.
Which is great.
Yeah.
Now, was there, speaking of that, you talk about going back to the text and Me Too being clear, was there any particular scene or aspect where you had to, discuss or negotiate, okay, what's the best approach here to bring this into English? Do we need to do something different from the German just so we maintain, because fidelity isn't just fidelity to the language, right? It's fidelity to the context and meaning. And just because you can translate something word for word into English, it may not keep the context or meaning. Was there anything like that you could share with us where you guys had to say, well, we're going to have to make a change, even though it's not true to the language, but it will now be true to the context and meaning for an English reader?
Me Too, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I did my best not to. I don't think I sent a single query as I worked on it. I really wanted to send Me Too a complete translation so that we could both sort of take it in as a whole. There is one. So I do remember thinking at certain times, I might be taking one liberty too many, or I might be pushing this too far. And I do think one instance where I went a little far is that because Nivedita or Nivedita or Niv or is so well read, her characters are reflecting on books that she's read that are in translation. Most of them, I believe, are British authors, but not all. There's a whole section of the book where we've got her class notes. So there was some complexity there. For the most part, those were all clear, but I think I realized, I thought, I was I was concerned that the English language reader might forget. This might be silly on my part, but when you're reading a story in English, unless place names are constantly mentioned, I do think the reader can get so involved in what's happening between characters that they might forget, this is happening in Germany, specifically in Dusseldorf. So there, when she's mentioning books that she's read and her perspective is changing, I think Pippi Longstocking is in there, several Enid Blyton books. I thought, well, of course, to my mind, because Nivedita is German, she would have been reading these in German translation, which also actually isn't a given because the German educational system is so good at teaching people foreign languages. But so there were times when I thought, it would be interesting for the reader to see that, she was experiencing this book as a translation. And I was naming the German translator who brought it from British English into German. And it really bogged down the text, I think. And I don't know if I can't remember if we discussed that, Me Too, or if the editor was just like, this isn't, it was a little off course,
No, we didn't discuss that, but you put in, when it was about the butter, Rama, and you put in an explanation that this came from the German word Rahm, for cream, and I love that. So that added an extra layer, and I loved the things you put in, and I love the liberties you took with the text. The only thing, if I were asked if I would do anything different, and I'm not even sure whether that would be better, I would like to have a bit of time to talk about rhythm, because my book is written to the rhythm of my breath. So the rhythm is different, and you can't know that. So you can't know where do I put the rhythm in, where is it important, and in certain parts. And then I think, yeah, maybe I have to trust you. Maybe I go along with your rhythm, and maybe that is right too then. But in certain parts, I wrote that like P.G. Wodehouse would say it. So I wrote to a P.G. Wodehouse rhythm. And obviously, if you don't know that, and then you haven't got that as a reference, and you've got to make decisions.
Yeah, but that intertextuality that you're talking about, Olta, I mean, that is such a feat just in the novel itself. I just thought the amount of the number of texts, Mitu, that you brought in as cultural references, which makes sense because of the character being who she is. But I lapped it all up. I loved it. I was saying that earlier too. So that so coming to that, also, you talk about how you make sure that you had a complete draft. So could you share a little bit about that translation approach in general? Do you? And it sounds like you do read around the text that you're translating. You read around it because you're picking up all these things. Were there any cultural aspects where, well, even if you finished, okay, so let's say you finished a complete draft and then you went back to Mitu, were there any things that it sounds like you didn't ask any questions as you went along. Is that right? It sounds like you finished.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I jotted myself a million questions, but I wasn't, and that, I think that's a common question of how closely did you work together? And it's like, I feel very closely, but I wasn't, sending her questions as they came up. And I do know translators who do that and authors who enjoy that. I also know authors who hate that.
Right,
and it makes them worry about the outcome. So I wanted to spare her that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I've been listening to interviews and reading interviews with Daisy Rockwell and Gitanjali Shree, and they've been talking about how they were constantly, throughout the translation process, back and forth. Now, I've never done that with my authors, mainly because, well, so far what's been published, the authors are dead, and so I can't commune with them anyways. But the one that I'm translating now, the novel, the author is very much alive. But like you, I prefer to give them a full finished draft. I don't want them to worry. Like, does he not even know this? Because sometimes what happens, like by the time you get to the end of the draft, you can answer some of your own questions. As you were saying, you were able to go back to the text and get some of the answers. And I think that's better, finish at least one draft, get the answers to your questions, then see what's remaining. So yeah, but I know that lots of translators prefer the other approach, and everybody has their own. I want to come to the wordplay in the text. And again, my German is very, very rusty. Anytime someone asks me, Sprechen Sie Deutsch, I just say, ein bisschen. my German is really bad. But as I was reading your translation and looking and coming across some of the wordplay you've done in the English, I kept wondering, and I do want to get the German version of the book now, just because I just want to, just because I still fancy that I know a little bit of German. But could you talk a little bit? I know it's always tough to translate. Humor is tough to translate, especially when it's humor from another culture. Maybe, is there an example or two maybe that you could share where you kind of had to create your own wordplay, create your own different word or phrase in the English, just to kind of capture that essence?
Yeah, well, to loop back to what Mitu said earlier about Rama and Ram, that was sort of a gloss that I felt had to be in there, because I realized this would be completely lost on the English language reader. I hope it's successful in English because I think it's very funny. Other parts, this is actually not in the book, but me too, you brought this up in a previous discussion about Indonets, right? Speaking of dialect differences, I actually tried to relate that, which I find hilarious, as Indonet. But of course, in trying to bring that into English, just in conversation with a colleague, I'm finding it hilarious, but it doesn't even, you can't, the best way to kill humor is to explain it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was just one thing where, that couldn't be brought across. But again, that wasn't in the text. That's just a sort of example of something that, had that been in the text, yeah, I don't know. I will say, I think the easiest example is the invented Twitter handles, some of which were brilliant. And I, let's see, we've got a lot of them were straightforward. God is into house. It was clear to me that had to stay as DAHAUS at the end. Yeah. Just a lot of, I think it was clear to me that Me Too had a lot of fun with the Twitter handles. I'm looking for an example. Oh, another thing, actually, I believe Saraswati consistently says, darling. Okay. And I felt, my instinct was, I can't have her saying darling, because to an English language reader, she might sound British. She might say, and I use darling with my friends, but it didn't strike the right tone for me. I felt like she would be saying Schatzi or Schätzchen or my Liebchen. There was also some wordplay that was very sonorous, like just based on the sounds of the words, and those had to be completely brought over into English. I'm trying to remember. Well, there was also a lot of English in the original. Like I'm looking at this line, win-win, blubbling, chuching. That's slightly different than what it was in the original, but I don't have the German in front of me. Maybe I should I go get my notes?
It is win-win bling bling. So that is so
I added, and I was like, is this going to be too much? And I trusted you to, if it felt like it was too far.
No.
Those rhythmic things, yeah, I mean, I'm looking here. There's actually one of the made up Twitter handles is free periods slay unicorns. And gosh, Me Too, do you remember what the original was on that? The Twitter handle is where have all the good girls gone?
No, I think that's exactly the same.
Was it free periods slay unicorns? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Those were in English.
Yeah, and then I think the hashtags. So correct me if I'm wrong, Me Too, you didn't have Saraswati Raus in the original, did you? It was like Sack Saraswati. I had
Saraswati Shame and Sack Saraswati and
yeah, so that was one. So I basically, in a weird way, peppered more German in certain parts of my English translation because it just felt right to me.
That is so fascinating. I would not have thought that. When I read, I thought that that's how it was in the original. So that's interesting. But now that you're explaining it, I can understand why.
Because in the internet, we use so much English. So if you look at German Twitter, it is half English anyway. But because there was so much English, because Preeti is from Britain, so she's from Birmingham. Right. And so she speaks this kind of mixed mash of English and German. And so you can't translate that. So you have to put some other German in. So that was great. So the mix of the bilinguality of it was in the text still.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's fascinating. I don't think I've ever done that, what you just said also, which is the original text had English, but you added the German in just to get that voice, which makes total sense. But I just assumed that that's what it was in the German, and that's why you chose to keep it, which is.
And that's why you have to get yourself a copy of the German original.
I have to. I think I have to, just because I think it'll be fun for me to even just try to read the German, feel the texture of the language again in my in my
And
mouth.
speaking of that, one of my favorite ways of thinking of translation is as a gateway drug.
yeah,
Right. You know, people who might be interested, they've maybe never thought of learning this other language, but if they can fall in love with the literature enough to want to read originals.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know how frequent that's actually, that kind of is one of my paths how to learning other languages, was having this curiosity and fundamentally wanting to have that more primary experience.
Right, right. And I love that when I have somebody who's like a second generation Gujarati person in the US, and they'll come to me and say, I don't read the language, but now I want to learn it because I want to read what you've translated in the original, which is like the biggest compliment, right? I mean, I think as a translator, if somebody tells me you made me want to read the original,
Yes.
I'm like, yes, mission accomplished, you know.
Yep.
This is great. And so thinking of the language, I do want to, well, I'm going to come back to the reception of the book, but I do want to ask, you know, also in your translator's postscript note, you've written this thing which I copied and pasted because I was like, wow. And you said that 2 decades ago, when you chose to study German, the reaction you got from North Americans about how, well, why do you want to study German? It's the ugly language of synapses. It resonated with me because when I took German at university, because I wanted to go work in Germany, I was asked, well, why? You could have taken, you had 2 choices. You had French. You could have gone with French. I was like, I totally got what you
that happened to you too. It's such a cliche, right? And
I know. And
are
I
these
was
people
like,
actually saying this to me?
Yeah, and I was like, I wanted to go to Germany at that time. It was 1991 when I started studying the language. The wall had just come down. I wanted to go there. I wanted to experience the culture, and I wanted to work with Siemens. I mean, what's so hard to understand, you know? But tell us about your, you know, because you were coming to it specifically for translation purposes. And so tell us a little bit about that reaction and then how you kind of stuck with it.
Well, so I won't say that I studied German specifically for translation purposes.
Okay.
I think translations inspired me to want to learn other languages.
Mm-hmm.
My curiosity in German, so a lot of my ancestry actually is I am of mixed, you know, German descent, but parts of Germany that were not Germany as we currently know it did not yet exist when my ancestors came to the United States. And so there was this general interest, and really this is also such a cliche, but I really loved Grimm's fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
And I had seen, you know, that we have the Disneyfied version of the Brothers Grimm, and then I was lucky enough to get my hand on a complete. I should go back and see. I don't have this book anymore, but I should know who translated it actually, of the complete, you know, the complete Brothers Grimm, including many fragments like they had, because it was an oral history that they wrote down, but it had been brought into English, and they were much more gruesome, you know. Is it, I don't want to mix up my myths now, but which one is it where is it Sleeping Beauty with the stepsisters and they're cutting their toes off to fit into the glass slipper?
That's Cinderella.
Yeah, it's Cinderella. Thank you.
Cinderella.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
Right, Cinderella. But you know, and the crow in that, it has there's rhyming, it's like a song, but they're gruesome and they're dark, and I thought that something is happening here and this is interesting. So I attended a fine arts academy. I went to art school. I've always loved art, didn't necessarily want to become an artist, but wanted to be trained in art. And so my interest in German was from a long, you know, went back to my childhood, but it was not offered at the school I went to. I could study Spanish or French. So I studied Spanish, even though there as well, it was like, if you're in honors other classes, you're supposed to take French, right? Because that's like the more elevated, all of this cultural baggage that we bring to language, right? Like, if you're a good student, you take French, and all the other people take Spanish. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. I could talk about this for hours, but yeah. So my first opportunity I came to language very late. I studied German. There happened to be a university literally across the street from the art school I was in. So I was taking German 4 days a week, just thinking, actually, I was studying printmaking and the history, and the history of the book had always fascinated me. So I had this idea of, oh, well, I could finally study German and go to Germany and go to Mainz for the history of the written word in the Western world, short of going to Far East Asia. So that's how it kind of started. And then I fell into translation many years later after, learning Italian and studying Italian.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I think every translator's origin story, there's some amount of, I think it's Mark Polizotti said this, there's some amount of serendipity in every translator's origin story. There's always, it's not a straight path. It's not like, okay, I am going to be a translator and therefore I am going to go study this language. It never just happens that way, does it? Whenever I've talked to them, ask them how they got into it, it's always a bit of that luck or chance. So that's fascinating. Thank you.
Yep.
I wonder if, Mitchell, do you happen to have the German book handy? Would you be able to maybe read just a small passage from it and then also maybe read a little bit of the same in English for us?
Yeah, sure. Shall we do the same that we did last time, or shall we do something else?
Let's try something new. I feel as though, if this is going to be out in the world.
Brilliant. Okay, so let me find something.
While you're looking and finding, I just want to say that this literary festival that I was at over the weekend, someone asked me to read some of the Twitter handles. And I mentioned, I was like, there are elements of this book that really don't want to be read out loud.
No, that is really hard.
Difficult.
So I'll read you this. Let's see. This is page 344 in my book. So it's about the song. It's about the folk song. Jedes Leben ist ein Song. Nivedita hatte das irgendwann irgendwo gelesen, wahrscheinlich in irgendeinem Nick Hornby-Taschenbuch, und fand es sofort einleuchtend. Sogar die Tatsache, dass sie absolut kein Lied ihres Lebens hatte, brachte diese Überzeugung nicht ins Wanken. Sie wertete sie lediglich als Zeichen dafür, dass sie kein echtes Leben hatte, zumindest nicht so echt, wie all die Leute ihr ständig Spotify-Playlisten schickten, aufrüttelnde Postings über Haftbefehls Wichtigkeit für die migrantische Community trotz seines Sexismus schrieben oder wie in einer Geheimsprache über Songzeilen kommunizierten, als wären Gefühle nur Gefühle, wenn sie mit Beats unterlegt waren. Natürlich hörte Nivedita Musik, schließlich war Musik überall. In ihrer WG-Küche, in Gauguin, auf jeder Manns und Fraus und Persons Handy, auf Sharasatis CD-Spieler, auf Kalis Lippen. Doch suchte sie nie nach dem einen Lied, das sie in ihrem ersten Sommersemester an der Heinrich-Heine-Uni gehört hatte oder bei ihrem ersten alles für immer verändernden Sex mit Anish oder bei ihrem ersten so schicksalhaften wie triumphalen Sex mit Simon. Nicht nach dem einen Song, der in einer begrenzten Anzahl von Minuten in der Welt existierte, sondern nach dem Gesang. Ein wenig so wie die Musik der Sphären. Und wenn sie endlich diesen großen Gesang fände, würde seine Klangfarbe die Gesamtheit ihrer Handlungen und Gedanken und Gefühle beschreiben. Ein solches Lied konnte es nur in Träumen geben, in Momenten des Einschlafens, wenn die Welt hinunter und der große innere Regler nach oben gezogen wurde. Deshalb war es ein solcher Schock, als sie sich eines Nachts hellwach durch YouTube klickte und plötzlich genau ihr Lied hörte. I am as brown can be. Mine eyes are as black as sloes, sang eine Frau in Niveditas Alter auf einer Bühne, die durch ihre fehlende Coolness und das Alter des Publikums eindeutig als Folk-Festival ausgewiesen war. Nivedita hatte nichts für, aber auch nichts gegen Folk. Sie hatte nur etwas gegen Lügen. Und die Sängerin war as white can be und ihre Augen waren blau oder grün, so genau konnte man es in dem Video nicht erkennen. Trotzdem konnte Nivedita nicht aufhören, ihr zuzuhören. I am brisk as can be. I am wild as any doe. Georgia Lewis, The Brown Girl, Child Ballad 295, stand unten über den ungewohnt wertschätzenden Kommentaren. Anscheinend waren Menschen durchaus in der Lage, im Internet respektvoll zu kommunizieren, solange es nicht um Race, Sex oder Homöopathie ging. Und Nivedita schloss aus der Spezifizierung, dass Georgia Lewis die Sängerin war, richtig, The Brown Girl der Song, richtig, und es sich um ein Kinderlied handelte. Falsch. Furioses Googlen ergab, dass Francis James Child eine Art Einmann-Gebrüder Grimm gewesen war und im 19. Jahrhundert 305 englische und schottische Balladen gesammelt hatte. The Brown Girl hatte er erst ziemlich am Ende seines Lebenswerks hinzugefügt, wie ein Nachgedanken. Ach ja, das gibt es ja auch noch, wenn es denn sein muss. Und Brown beziehe sich darauf, dass das Mädchen nicht die lilienweiße Haut einer Lady habe, sondern bei der Feldarbeit von der Sonne verbrannt worden sei, informierte sie die Webseite Manly Norfolk. Nivedita war empört. Auch die Überraschung Folk-Community war anscheinend farbenblind und bevorzugte es, Diskriminierung nicht wahrzunehmen, solange ein Lied nicht explizit racist face hieß. Child hatte das Lied in der Blütezeit des britischen Empires eingesammelt. Natürlich kam das braune Mädchen aus den Kolonien, wer denn sonst? Wochen später fand Nivedita eine Version, in der es sogar einen Namen hatte. Trommelwirbel, Priti. Sie hieß Priti wie Niveditas Cousine. Und deshalb wollte ihr weißer Geliebter sie auch nicht heiraten, der rassistische, klassistische, bequeme, bauchnabelzentrierte Feigling. Soweit so Simon. Doch im Song wurde dieser Lover Once So Bold alsbald von seinem gebrochenen Herzen dahingerafft und erkannte, dass er ohne sein Brown Girl nicht leben konnte, und zwar nicht im übertragenen Sinn, sondern tatsächlich. Also rief er sie an sein Sterbebett und bat um Vergebung. Und als wäre das alles bis dahin noch nicht unwahrscheinlich genug gewesen, lachte sie ihn aus und tanzte am Ende auf seinem grünen Grab.
Well, thank you for that. I just loved I didn't catch everything. I caught a few words and phrases that I knew, but not the whole thing. So I'm looking forward to hearing the English from Malta as well.
Lovely, but me too. You just had to choose a section where I'm gonna have to sing.
I was just gonna say.
Nobody wants to hear me sing. Okay. And it started out, we started Every Life is a Song, right? Okay. Okay, fabulous. And it's so great to hear you read this, me too. Okay, this is page 288 of the North American version. Every life is a song. Nivedita had read that somewhere at some point, maybe in some Nick Hornby paperback, and it immediately resonated. Not even the fact that she had no song nor soundtrack whatsoever for her own life cast any doubt on the idea. She just read it as a sign that she wasn't really living, or that her life didn't count as much as everyone else's, meaning everyone who was constantly sending her their Spotify playlists, writing rousing posts about the importance of arrests within immigrant communities despite said posts' sexism, and communicating solely by quoting song lyrics like speaking some secret code, as if feelings were only really feelings when they came with a beat. Of course, Nivedita listened to music. After all, music was everywhere. The communal kitchen of her student apartment, the Gauguin, the every man and every woman and every person's phone, Sarasvati's CD player, Collie's lips. But she'd never sought out that one song she'd heard during her first semester at Heinrich Heine University, or the one that was playing when she and Anish had permanently life-altering sex, Indian both outside and inside, even in my vag. Who's the coconut now? Or the one playing when she and Simone had their first fateful yet triumphant makeup sex. Every breakup brings a new beginning. Everything is predestined. She'd never sought out the song that lasted just a few earthly minutes. No, what she was after was the song, something akin to the music of the celestial spheres. And if she were ever to actually find the one big song, she was certain its timbre would perfectly encapsulate the entirety of her behaviors and relationships and thoughts and feelings. A song like that could only exist in your dreams, in the kind of twilight state as you drifted off to sleep, as the world slipped away and your entire being somehow cranked up its huge internal dial. So it came as quite a shock one night as Nivedita was wide awake and scrolling through YouTube when she finally heard her exact song. And I apologize, I don't know that I can't remember the tune for these two lines. I am as brown as can be, my eyes are black as slow. A woman Nivedita's age sang on stage. Her utter coolness plus the average attendee's median age range led Nivedita to correctly surmise it had been recorded at a folk festival. Nivedita wasn't really into folk, but she didn't really have anything against it either. But what she did have a thing against was lying. And the chick singing this was as white can be, with eyes of blue or green. You couldn't quite tell from the low-res video, but they sure as hell weren't black as slow. Nevertheless, Nivedita couldn't help but keep listening. I am brisk, I am brisk, I am brisk as can be. She'd had to look up the word brisk on lingue.com, and then she'd had to look up doe. I'm as wild as any doe. Up above the unusually appreciative string of comments, she read, Georgia Lewis, The Brown Girl, Child Ballad 295. Apparently, people actually were capable of being polite on the internet as long as race, sex, and homeopathy weren't involved. Sorry, homeopathy.
Isn't it homeopathy? I thought that was right.
I say homeopathy. No, I got it wrong too now.
I think it's in Britain it's this, and in America it's something else. It's one of those.
Yeah.
Welcome to translation land, where, I mean, 2 pages into anything, I no longer know how to pronounce anything in English. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's what happened to me too. Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, let's see. That header led her to deduce that Georgia Lewis was a singer, correct. The Brown Girl was the song, correct. And that it was a ballad for children, incorrect. A frenzied bit of Googling resulted in the discovery that Francis James Child had been a kind of one-man Brothers Grimm, who back in the 19th century had gone around England and Scotland and collected 305 traditional ballads. The Brown Girl was apparently added toward the end of his life, like an afterthought. Oh yeah, there's this one too, if you really must. And supposedly brown referred to the fact that this girl didn't have the lily white skin of a lady, but rather the sunburnt skin of a field hand, or so said the website mainlynorfolk.info. Nivedita was appalled. Surprise, surprise. Even the folk music community claimed to be colorblind and preferred not to acknowledge racism unless a song was not explicitly titled Racist McRace-Faced. I just love the Bodie McBoatface reference. Okay, sorry. Child had added the song to his collection at the height of the British Empire, and of course the girl came from the colonies. Where else? Weeks later, Nivedita even discovered she'd had a name. Drum roll, please. Pretty. Her name was Pretty, although back in her day, it had been spelled P-R-I-T-H-E-E, Prithee, and that's why her white lover didn't want to marry her, the racist, classist, lazy, navel-gazing coward. So far, so simony. But in this song, this lover once so bold ultimately succumbed to a broken heart and became so lovesick that he couldn't live, not just figuratively, but literally, without his brown girl. So then he summoned her to his deathbed to beg her forgiveness. And as if all that weren't implausible enough, she just laughed at him. The song ends with her dancing on his green, green grave.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that. I mean, just listening to this, you're absolutely right. I can tell how much fun you must have had, me too, with all the cultural references and the layers and layers. And just, I mean, I think Nivedita as a character, I would love to meet her in person. I think she would just be a fun person to meet, right? Just because with all this knowledge and her kind of dry, ironic way of looking at the world, I think is terrific. Well, thank you both for that. And I'm gonna
and then
yes,
it is why I've chosen that bit, A, because the reference was rather grim, but also because that was one of the bits that was to be excluded from the translation, and kind of Alta and I said, no, please, let's keep this in, because it's not really important for the action. So it's just a side, but it tells us a lot about how Nivedita experiences the world and how she's trying to fit everything on. Can I find myself in the world? And she can't find herself, not even in songs.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a very important and telling part of the, just the whole narrative. I thought it was, I'm surprised, and I didn't realize it was going to be cut. Oh, wow. Okay. I'm glad it stayed. Thank you for telling us that. That's great. Let me close with two of our last questions, and then I've taken enough of your time. But one question I have for both of you is, what is next for each of you after Identity? Me too. I heard somewhere, read somewhere, you might be working on another novel.
I am working on another novel. I've just finished a book about Emily Bronte, which is going to be out in 6 days or 10 days, so on the 6th of October. And so that was a lot of fun. It was also therapy. So basically, I've been writing about something I've been reading about all my life. And so I've just started my next novel, which is set at the beginning, a big chunk of it is set at the beginning of the 20th century. So 1906 to 1908-9 in London. So it's a different place. And it's mainly about this question of, non-violent resistance versus armed resistance. And this is, one of the main things I'm grappling with. It's also about Hindu nationalism. And so, yeah, it's...
yeah, it's going to be another interesting one. So the Emily Bronte book is coming out. You said you're going to finish it. Is it, when is it?
No, it's finished. I've got it here. Wait.
Oh, let's see the cover.
Yeah.
This is the book.
Okay.
So it's a bit. I'm a bit embarrassed. It says Emily Bronte here, very small. My name quite big, but this is just a design. And they've also printed the inside. So for some reason, lovely things on the inside. And it's
so that is coming out in the next few
days, so to speak. Yeah.
Great. And sorry, but that is in English?
No, that's in German. So I don't know whether it's going to be translated or not, because it just it should be actually.
Of course, it should be.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Hardly anybody knows. So I've done a lot of myth debunking, and nobody knows all the myths and all the preconceptions about the Brontes. And so in German, it's kind of, great. I tell the truth, but you never believed it. So because you didn't know who she was anyway, you thought she was the author of Jane Eyre.
Oh, I would love to read it in English. I'm sure I couldn't read it in the German, but I would love to read it because there's so many myths about the Brontes, right? And we see the televised. The adaptations
again. And it tells us so much about how we want to see women writers, and so we want them either as tragic or as this kind of superhuman Emily Bronte, as this, and then she beats up her dog. She has never beaten up her dog. It's a myth. But we have pictures of it.
Yeah. Well, I wish you all the best. I'm keeping my fingers crossed it gets translated because I'd love to read it. And then Alta, what's next for you once this book is out in the UK and Europe?
So I'm currently translating Ulysses' book, Übermenschen.
Which is really funny because kind of there are a lot of links and a lot of differences. So that's amazing.
Yeah, it's a bizarre, it makes complete sense to me, but it's also quite a shift. So that's what I'm working on now. My last work from Italian was actually quite related to German because it was Giorgio Agamben's philosophical treatise about the late poetry of Friedrich Hölderlin. Mm-hmm. So that will be coming out from Seagull Books, I believe in November, December. Yeah. To me, it's funny because I do this broadly disparate work, but it's all very connected in my mind. So that's what I'm up to. But I also want to mention that Me Too is so incredibly prolific. And Me Too, you sent me this beautiful, was it the foreword that you wrote for the new German edition of which James Baldwin book?
The Fire Next Time.
Yeah. So
it was no. Sorry, it wasn't. I've got it here. Sorry.
A new German translation of Baldwin.
Yeah.
Native son, Notes of a Native Son.
Ah, okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
So,
Yeah,
you know,
interesting.
what I love is knowing, having worked on this novel with Mitude, but knowing that she's just like basically anything that comes out of Mitude's pen will be worth reading. I
Right.
firmly believe that. So I really hope that this is the first of many.
Great.
Very
And-
do I, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you both for that. My very last question is, could you share with us your favorite translated book and why? Any language, from any language into any language. I know it's hard. Favorite is tough. So, you know, it could be a reread, something you read recently, but a translated book. And I do this so that we can give recommendations to our viewers and our audience.
I know I was very impressed by Harry Rowohlt's translation of Winnie the Pooh. He did an amazing job there. And he managed to get it is about language. It's such a beautiful, and it's really not a children's book because children are bored by it. They're bored to death. So, but adults love reading it to their children, and so he managed to really translate that amazingly. He's also he used to be, he's dead now, but he's also incredibly funny, telling loads of a bottle of pop. So he's talking about another translator who won loads of translators prizes and very well known. I'm not going to mention his name. And so he translated a bottle of pop as a bottle of popcorn. No.
My goodness. Wow.
And it doesn't even exist. A thing like a bottle of popcorn doesn't exist. So what's it's like time goes. It's brilliant.
That's hilarious.
That is hilarious.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was okay. That's a great recommendation. And then also, any favorite translated work that you'd like to share?
Yeah. So aside from that, Complete Brothers Grimm, who I need to do more homework and remember who translated it. I'm actually just sorry. I'm going to grab it from the top of this pile, because you know whether this will remain my favorite forever, I don't know, but I do want to bring attention to it. Amanat came out, I believe, a couple of months ago from a very small press here in the US called Gaudy Boy Press. It's women's writing from Kazakhstan. They're all short stories. It's just mind-blowing. So it was.
It is recent. I do remember reading about that. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so it's selected and translated by Shelley Fairweather Vega and Zaure Batayeva. A combination of some were translated from Kazakh and some were translated from Russian, right? But these stories, it's like, talk about literatures, and I try and really get away from, I believe, maybe it's not unique to the United States, but it's so, literature and translation is so often approached with sort of an anthropological viewpoint, and I like to get away from that, but this truly transported me to places I had never been. And so I think, and you know, short story collections are difficult. It's but I was really impressed with the job that the translators did. So that's my current, but you know, I have this problem that when I'm really deeply working on a translation, like my Ulysses translation is due very, very soon, that kind of consumes my entire brain.
Absolutely, yeah, of course. Yeah, and that's why I say not recently read, but just favorite of any time. Yes, me too.
Now you mention it, brilliant. My brain starts working again. I remember I was that sounds very goody two shoes, but I was really, really impressed by Gayatri Chakravarty's translation of Draupadi, Amashweta Devi's short story Draupadi. And it wasn't just the translation, it was also the text she wrote about the short story, and that got me into Mahashweta Devi, and that was kind of life-changing reading that.
Yeah, you know, I know a lot of people who came to Mahashweta Devi because of the Spivak.
Yeah.
They didn't know of her, and I think Spivak put her on the map, right, in terms of Western readership, which is amazing. And I think there's a new collection of Spivak essays out right now somewhere. Yeah. Yes, I did the September. Yes, it came out in September. There is a new collection of her essays, obviously posthumous, but yeah. So, and I think that she has an essay about Martha Devi in there, if I recall
That
correctly.
should be on my reading list.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you both so much. This was amazing, and I know I could ask questions forever, but I know I'm trying to be mindful of your time. I really appreciated both of you sharing this work, this amazing work, and I will be sharing our conversation very soon, with a few excerpts from the translator's postscript as well as the book. And thank you both very much.